and I very quickly learned that I cannot trust anybody on Goodreads or probably anybody on the internet in general because they do not know what genres are.
Welcome to Keep It Fictional, a weekly podcast for book lovers by book lovers. Build your to-be-read list with Sadie, Liz, Virginia, Fiona, and Corrine from the Port Moody Public Library. Warning, this podcast contains strong opinions and may cause an increase in your library holds list.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Keep It Fictional, the book lovers podcast from the Port Moody Public Library. My name is Sadie, and I will be your host for today. And I am joined by my book friends, Virginia, Corrine, and Emma. Today, we are going to be talking about one of my favorite genre mashups, and that is historical fantasy. This one does not have a fancy name, portmanteau type name like romantasy, but I feel like we could maybe make one up. So this mashup very clearly blends historical fiction and fantasy, two of my favorite genres. And I am very excited to hear what books my book friends have read for this week. But before we get to that, I'm curious. So I know that some of my book friends read fantasy. I know that some of my book friends read historical fiction, but I'm curious if this is a mashup that you find yourselves gravitating towards, or do you prefer to keep your fantasy and your history separate?
I could say that I do enjoy a good historical fantasy. It's a genre that I really don't mind. I think it can be done extremely well. I always want to kind of question the author as to why. Why is it to kind of make a commentary on the particular norms of the time that you're bringing in this fantasy element? What does it kind of bring to the story? What commentary are you making by using that kind of very historical setting and bringing the fantasy element into it? But as a genre, I do love it. I mean, the real cliche is the Victorian gaslight fantasy girl with powers, and I don't mind it. I don't mind.
That is one of my favorites. I have to say that. Yeah, I read a lot of those types of books.
I feel like for me, I don't do the Victorian fantasy stuff. I never got into the steampunk or anything like that. And I tend to lean more sci-fi than I do fantasy. So when I do historical sci-fi, it's typically things that are really futuristic. But I do enjoy a good historical fantasy. I like historical fiction. I like magic. This sounds weird to say out loud. I don't love too much magic. I don't love really intense magic systems with where everything in the story revolves around magic, but I like a story with a little bit of magic kind of trickled in there. So it's something that I don't necessarily read often, but I usually enjoy it when I do find one.
I have a follow-up question. Maybe I just don't have enough coffee. How does historical sci-fi work?
When I read that the Aliette de Bodard book for the Dragons episode that I ended up not talking about, it kind of felt historical. It didn't feel like it took place in contemporary times, but it was more sci-fi than it was fantasy. So there was magic and science kind of blended in to the history. But like I said, I feel like sci-fi is typically futuristic sci-fi. So it's historical and that it doesn't take place right now, but it takes place in the future. I also haven't had enough coffee, so I feel like it's just word vomit right now.
I definitely prefer my fantasy to be fantasy. I don't like it mixed as much, even though I do. I think when I end up reading what people would consider to be historical fantasy, I do enjoy them, but I feel like sometimes I find those ones often more historical than it ends up being more historical than fantasy. When I read the She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan, which is considered to be historical. I'm but what's it just doesn't feel very fantasy to me. It just feels more historical, which I do enjoy it. But that's a way to trick me into reading a historical fiction because I don't read them. But if you labeled it a certain way, maybe.
Well, I know you enjoyed the Poppy War, and when I was doing a quick panic Google last night of what is a historical fantasy book, that one did come up. And I think that again is someone who's very intelligently blending the two genres together to say something a little bit different. But yeah, I can see how you like to keep your plates separate.
I think that's so much a lot of the time periods that these are set in, just by the fact that there are kings and queens and knights and those kinds of things. Often that is the fantastical element that people are relying on, and it doesn't always have that magical aspect or the dragons aspect. And so I think it does kind of blend together. The history and the fantasy does just kind of blend together sometimes.
I was just going to say that's the problem that I had with my book this week because it's kind of medieval. So people think it's fantasy, but I'll get to this more later. But there really isn't a lot of fantasy happening. I'll talk more about it later. I won't get into it now. But it does have it takes place in the medieval period. There's knights, there's kings, there's queens, there's all that kind of political intrigue. So I think people assume that it's going to be fantasy because they're like, oh, medieval, dragons, they have to go together. But anyway.
No kind of slight to you, Emma, because I got halfway through my book and I was like, oh God, there better be some magic coming up soon because I do not want to have wasted half my night.
Well, we will just have to wait and see for both Emma's and Kareen's books. Will they actually be fantasy? But we are going to start off today with Virginia. So Virginia, as a not a huge historical fantasy reader, what book did you pick for today?
All right. So I think we have done an episode on what type of book tropes that we like. Don't remember what I said, but anyway. But if we were to do an episode on what type of settings that we like our stories to be, I have two answers. And they're kind of the same, but in a different orientation. I think my favorite setting is usually like a ridiculously tall building. Something about a story that happens in like a skyscraper where it's basically like its own country, it's got its own laws, it does whatever it wants, and preferably like every single level has its own like flavor, has its own uniqueness. And so the story could be like, us learning about like the people that live there, or it could be, an outsider trying to go in, trying to figure out like what the deal is about this place. That's usually like one of my favorite settings. And if you take that very tall building and you rotate it 90 degrees, and then you add some wheels to it, we get a train. Really, stories that happen on a train has a very special appeal. I don't know why, because I'm not like into trains at all. My household has a subscription to a train magazine, but that's not mine. I have nothing about trains in real life, but yet stories that take place on trains are really interesting to me. And I think maybe also to do with the fact that we did talk about this question recently. One of our contested questions these days is it about the journey and the destination? It's definitely about the journey for me. So train stories kind of makes sense because you're kind of stuck. And it is like nothing can get in, nothing can get out, supposedly. And that is something that is of interest to me. Anyway, so when I was looking for a book for today's episode, I found a historical fantasy that came out just, I think, last month in June that is set on a train. So I thought like, yeah, immediately that is the one that I'm going to read. So the book is called The Cautious Traveler's Guide to the Wastelands, and it's by Sarah Brooks. The Wasteland. 3,000 miles of Siberian tundra between China and Russia. A strange and mysterious place where we know very, very little about. No humans live there, but something sure does. What is it? No one knows. And the Wasteland's definitely not a place you want to find yourself in. It's dangerous and it's known to drive people mad. In 1899, if you want to go between China and Russia, most railroads go around the wastelands. It's simply too dangerous because you never know what's out there. But not the Great Trans-Siberian Express. This enormous train cuts through the wastelands, giving you a direct route between the two countries, taking a shortcut, saving passengers a ton of travel time. Not only that, is the symbol of prestige if you're able to afford this train ride. For whatever reason, people feel just a little bit of a thrill going on a train, knowing that this is going to go through the wastelands. But the Trans-Siberian Express is also one of the most luxurious trains that you can take. Just the most comfortable and extravagant experience that you'll ever have on a train. But is it safe? Oh yes, the company will tell you. Our trains are impenetrable, made of the strongest stuff, designed by the best people. Everything is built to protect you and to keep you safe from whatever that is out there. We only ask that when you're traveling, just don't look outside. Keep those curtains closed, because even just a look at the outside at the Wastelands, sometimes people catch some sort of fever, and the crew is always on the lookout for anyone who exhibits any kind of symptoms because, like I said, the Wastelands is known to drive people mad. And also, don't worry, there's a sniper right there ready to shoot if anything comes near the train. So don't worry about it. It is all good. But it wasn't all good. The last time the train crosses the wasteland, something terrible happens. Weirdly, no one seems to remember what happened. Everybody who was on the train has a bit of a memory lapse. And, the company is okay with that. They are okay with people not remembering it. But they do have to stop operating for a while. But the Great Trans-Siberian Express is back, operating again to carry passengers from Beijing to Moscow just in time for the great exhibition in Moscow. Among the passengers, we have quite a few who has their own reason to get on the train. And everybody seems to have a secret. We have Maria, a woman traveling under a fake name, who's trying to figure out what happened to her father. Her father, who was the person who made all the windows for the Trans-Siberian Express. We have a naturalist named Henry Gray, a disgraced academic, and he's hoping to rescue and revive his reputation among his colleagues by doing something pretty reckless on this trip. And they're always the crows, the representatives of the train company, always watching everybody and everything that goes on. And then there's Wei Wei, who was actually born on the train. Her mother died in childbirth, and she has never known anywhere but the train. This is the only family that she knows. Wei Wei, who's able to go from train car to train car freely, was able to see everything that goes on. And of course, every train story has to have a stowaway. And this stowaway may or may not be human. What can go wrong? Nothing, according to the company, of course, but we all know that's not going to be the case. Now, the book has been described as magical, as twisty, as inventive, full of fascinating characters. It's an immersive fantasy that is spellbinding. And this is definitely a book for someone who loves, I think, that historical feel to a fantasy, who look forward to the prospect of encountering something just a little bit strange, a little bit fantastical, and of course, for someone who loves mysteries. Now, if that premise sounds good to you and if you think you may be the reader for this book, I'm going to suggest you go pick up the book and skip the next 3 or 4 minutes onto our next book, friend, because I'm going to describe my experience with the book, which is slightly different from what everybody else is saying. And I do firmly believe that every book has a reader. And just like I would only listen to readers who look for similar things as I do in reading, you should also. So don't listen to me, who's probably not the right audience for this book. Trying to be diplomatic here. I was definitely thrown off right from the start from what I heard about this book, because among many other authors who provide a blurb for the book, and also Library Journal, thanks Library Journal, says that this is as if a luxury train races through Jeff Vandermeer's Area X. Lots of blurbs also alluded to this book being China Miéville-esque. I don't know why his name keeps coming up these days, but that's what people are comparing this book to. And if you have read any of those authors, you know that it is going to be very strange, right? His name is not synonymous with weird fiction, the whole genre, for no reason. So you really cannot invoke his name lightly. When you tell me that a book is Vandermeer-like, I'm expecting a whole ton of weirdness. That's not what I got, as you may have gathered. So again, I'm going to say that I was misled, therefore had a bad experience, maybe. I don't know. I think for me, it was a bad thing, obviously, because it didn't have all the weirdness that I was expecting. But again, for a lot of readers, maybe that's what they want in a book, right? They just want just a little bit. Like they want things to be a little bit more steady, a little bit more normal. They don't want anything extreme. this would be the book for you, because I think I find the descriptions of the wasteland very tame, very mild. Again, not what I was looking for. And I also kind of disagree with a lot of the statements that were made by many of the reviewers. The pacing was so slow. Like, great setup. I love the setup. Like, nothing happens. And I also find that a lot of the characters, they're not distinguishable. Like, there's a couple that I'm like, who are you again? Like, I keep getting them mixed up. If you're going to throw a bunch of people on a train, you need to have them like be very distinct from one another so that I can follow your different storylines. So I find that I was having difficulty with that. Maybe because I just didn't really care for it. So it's like, it's really hard for me to invest in a story with people that I'm just like, whatever happens to you. My husband and I often talk about like inoffensive music. The kind that you can put in the background that you don't really notice. They're kind of like your white noise. It doesn't bother you. It doesn't draw your attention to it. It's not the type that you feel like you have to sing along or anything like that. So it's not distracting at all. It's just in the background. And that's kind of how I would describe this book. It's fine. It's there. I don't really have a lot of like super strong feelings about it. It's not like, at least I'm not angry about the book, which a lot of books I am, like I despise passionately, but this is not one of those books. It's just like, it's just there. It's just not super memorable, at least for me. I listened to this on audiobook, and whenever I had a bad reading experience, I always used to blame myself. I always think like, you know what? It's just me not being good at audiobooks, and that is why, right? Like that's how I always feel. But I'm going to stop doing that, because if I can listen and get completely absorbed in like 25 hours of Midnight's Children or 26 hours of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicles, then I don't think it's me being bad at it. I think the book is just not very good. Anyway, so yeah, that is my experience with this book. Again, I think it might just be me. I'm not the right audience for this book. So I don't want to just discourage everybody from reading it, because clearly other people love it. Anyway, so the book is called The Cautious Traveler's Guide to the Wastelands, and it is by Sarah Brooks. And I do like the cover. It's got a little train that goes around it. Anyway, that's what it got going for it.
It's funny because as you were describing it, I was thinking, I think this would actually be a really good book for my husband. Like this sounds like the premise sounds like he would really like it. But then knowing that he also he quite enjoys like Jeff Vandermeer, and knowing that it's not that, I don't know anymore. I'm not sure, because I know he likes the weird and twisty stuff as well. And he does like things when things happen in books. So maybe not. But we'll see. We'll see if I recommend it to him. Well, thank you, Virginia, for that very honest review. Sometimes it's just not going to be the book for us, and that's okay. I am going to go next. And the book that I chose for this week is one that I actually read last year. And I really liked it. I listened to the audiobook as well, and I really, really enjoyed it. As you all know, probably by this point, I read a lot of fantasy and paranormal books, which feature all manner of kind of fantastical creatures. However, I feel like this book has focused on a mythological being that is maybe not quite as represented in popular media as others are, and that is a reaper. This is the being who is responsible for collecting souls, alerting people that their death is coming up or that their death is here. The most recognizable, of course, is the European Grim Reaper, first appearing around the 14th century during the Black Death. And this Reaper, as many people I'm sure know, is recognizable as the skeletal being who appears in their black cloak with their scythe to tell you that your time amongst the living is over. Now, however, this is not the only Reaper that is out there. This is just one culture's ideas of what death would look like if it were personified. The idea that a being will come and take your soul away is actually quite prevalent in many different religions and cultures. In Celtic mythology, it is the Anku, who appears as a haggard version of the last person to die in a village. In Hindu mythology, it's the Yamaraja and his Yamadutas, who ride a black buffalo and carry a lasso to carry the souls back to his home. In Korean mythology, it's the Netherworld emissary, who's depicted as a stern and ruthless bureaucrat in the service of the great king Yomna. And in Japanese mythology, it is the goddess Izanami, who was abandoned in the underworld, or Yomi as it's called, by her husband Izanagi after he saw her to be less beautiful than she was in life. Izanami also has a team of Shinigami death gods who are actually the ones who bring the souls to her. Now, the Reapers in my book, while they do appear at the moment of death and take a person's soul, they don't encompass the skeletal being persona quite as much. This book is The Keeper of the Night by Kylie Lee Baker. And as we mentioned already on this episode, it takes place during one of my favorite historical periods to read about, and that is the Victorian era. I would say that it doesn't kind of follow, when you think about reading a Victorian fantasy, it doesn't really follow kind of all of those rules that you usually see in a Victorian fantasy. But it does begin in London in the year 1890. And it follows Wren Scarborough. And Wren Scarborough is a British reaper. She spends her nights collecting the souls of the newly dead. She's young for a reaper. She's only a couple hundred years old. And she doesn't waste her time on reassuring words or comforting platitudes for those whose souls she has come to collect. She's direct, and some may think she's rather cruel in her approach. However, her cruelty is nothing compared with the other young British reapers who spend all of their time making Wren's life miserable. And this is because Wren is not just a British reaper. Her father is a British reaper, but her mother is a Japanese Shinigami. This has meant that for Wren's entire life, she has been an outsider. And the other reapers will not let her forget it. Sometimes it's subtle acts of discrimination, like forgetting to check in her souls until after the deadline and earning her punishment from the council. But more often, it's cruel and violent. As an immortal, Wren heals rather quickly, and it is almost impossible to kill her. However, that does not stop the breaking of the bones, removing of fingers, and threats to gouge out her eyes. All of these things are just as painful, if not permanent, for Wren. It is during one of these attacks by her fellow reapers that Wren makes a mistake she can't come back from. She accidentally uses her Shinigami powers to fend off her attackers. The powerful light and burning fire that results definitely deflects them. However, she wounds them horribly in the process. She knows that the council will never let this slide, and that her actual immortal life may finally be in real danger. So she does the only thing she can think of. She runs, hastily packing a bag and rushing out of her home. As she leaves, her younger half-brother Nevin begs to come along. Since he is the only one who has ever shown her any kindness and any true love and caring, she eventually agrees. The two of them decide to journey to Japan, where Wren's plan is to go to Yomi and pledge her service to Izanami as a Shinigami, hoping that in the process, Izanami may be able to tell her where she can find her mother. Wren is excited to finally go somewhere where her differences won't be quite so obvious, and where she can finally not be seen as an outsider. However, this is not the experience that Wren is destined to have. She finds that she is seen as just as much of an outsider in Japan as she was in England. While she may resemble the Japanese Shinigami more than she does the blonde-haired Nevin, she finds that the sense of belonging she had hoped for upon arriving in Japan is just not going to happen. But Wren is very stubborn and refuses to give up on her quest. So she and Nevin search for a way into Yomi. This is where they meet Hiro. Hiro is a fishing spirit and disgraced Shinigami who acts as their guide into the pure darkness of the underworld. Right from the start, it's pretty clear that Hiro is also an outsider. He walks with a limp and is seen as useless because of it, both by Izanami herself and all the rest of the Shinigami. Nevin is immediately worried about what Hiro's true motivations are in helping Wren, and a rift between the two of them forms and continues growing. When Wren is finally able to see Izanami, the goddess of death is as cruel, harsh, and unwelcoming as all of the British Reapers put together. But she does finally agree to let Wren join her Shinigami, but only if she can complete 3 tasks. She's tasked to kill 3 very powerful yokai, which are supernatural spirits. And if she kills them, then Izanami will make her a true Shinigami. So Wren, Nevin, and Hiro set out on a journey across Japan, where Ren will be tested again and again to see if she is strong enough, determined enough, and cruel enough to finally get the belonging she has always wanted. This book is very dark, probably a lot darker than I would usually read. Throughout the book, Ren shows very little mercy for anyone who gets in her way, including her brother Nevin. And her actions are often extremely violent and bloody and described in quite a lot of detail. The cruelty and the bullying in this book are also quite severe. And I would say that if this is a trigger for you, then you might want to skip this one because they do go into quite a lot of detail describing it. I think that Kylie Lee Baker put an interesting spin on the character of Ren, as I would say that at most points, she's actually not a very likable or sympathetic character. However, I found that actually worked quite well with the story. And I think that as a protagonist, you're still rooting for her to win, even if you don't always agree with her choices about how she goes about doing it. Baker is a person of mixed race herself, and she really wanted to show what that experience can be like. For Ren, she suffered a lot, not just in a physical sense with the violence and the bullying, but also in an emotional sense of never having a place that she truly felt like she belonged. She was always seen as an outsider no matter where she was. And I think that this has rightly so taken a huge toll on Ren, and that comes out in the way that she goes through her life and interacts with others. Kylie Lee Baker did a really good job of showing that experience and showing that representation. That being said, Ren definitely does have a journey and progresses and changes as the book goes on, which I think is always appreciated. Being able to see the characters as real people. It's just not always in the way that you would expect or that you would want it to go. The book ended in a way that I never really would have guessed, but I actually kind of appreciated that. I like being able to guess parts of an ending, but it's sometimes nice to be absolutely completely surprised by how a book is going to end. It's set up nicely for a sequel, which it does have. It's a duology, and so it does have a sequel, Empress of the Night, I think, which I haven't had a chance to read yet, but it's definitely on my TBR. But yeah, all in all, I really, really enjoyed the book. I think it's very atmospheric. It kind of brings you into kind of the dark underworld of Japan and kind of transports you into that time period in Japan as well. The characters spend most of their time dealing with other supernatural beings, but there is some interaction with humans and with non-supernatural beings as well, and kind of as a representation of what was going on at that time in Japan. And so yeah, I really, really enjoyed the book. I think that if you are looking for a historical fantasy, it definitely fits that. If you like something that's a little bit darker and doesn't kind of have that sunny, sunshine, happy, adventure-y feel to it, it definitely has an adventure and a focus to it and a journey, but it's not in an upbeat and happy way all the time. So if that does sound like something that you would enjoy, then I would definitely recommend The Keeper of the Night by Kylie Lee Baker. Okay. I think it is time for our existential question. Now, we discussed whether we've done this one before, and we might have, but I'm curious to see if people's answers have changed, if that's the case. And I don't think Emma had a chance to answer this one. So my existential question for you all is, if you could go back to any historical time period, what would it be? And if you want to tell us why, you could do that as well.
I think this might have been my same answer from last time, but pass. I'm just going to stay here. This is fine. Like maybe 5 years ago, like pre kind of like pandemic, when things are a little bit more chill. That's my ideal kind of sweet spot. Yeah, I'm going to go. When was pandemic?
2020.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I'm going back to 2018. That seems like a pretty good year.
Yeah, no, I think I'm very much the same. Like, I was just like, it's fine now. Why are we going back? But like, if I were, just to answer the question, I think it would be there's two things. One would be like go back to ancient Rome and see if I can remember any of my Latin and I can actually hear how it's supposed to sound like, because none of us really know how it sounds like. So I would love to know actually how they pronounce things and how they say things. And then maybe I'll be able to have a conversation with a dead language. No, not that language at that point. So maybe that. And then the other option, I would like to go back to 1995, because that's when Jerome McGinley got drafted into NHL, and I did not watch hockey at that point. I was very stupid. By the time I started watching hockey, the best years of his career was like before, and I never got to see him play in the Cup final. So I would like to go back and in the beginning of his career to watch this. This is like the stupidest answer, but like that's the only thing I think of. So again, I need more coffee, clearly.
Like, is this a scenario where we get to go back and like punch someone in the face? Like, I should have asked for like parameters on that.
You totally could if that's the choice that you've made. Rethinking their career, rethinking where you want to go.
I'm having a thought. There's just so many candidates.
If I could go back and punch anyone in the face, it would be George Bush in like the year 2000 or something. But to kind of copy Virginia a little bit, when you're talking about wanting to watch this very specific hockey player, like I'm a baseball fan, and I wasn't a Cubs fan in 2016 when they broke the curse, the 108-year curse, and finally won a World Series. So when it happened, I was like, oh my God, this is the greatest thing to ever happen to the city of Chicago. But I wasn't as committed at the time to like watching every game and following that like team of all-stars. So if I could go back, like just for that one baseball season and also like just relish in what it was like to be in America pre-Trump, that would be really wonderful. But also to like properly answer the question, thinking about historical time periods, it's a complicated answer because like I love learning about like medieval history or early modern history, and it would be so cool to be able to just like ride around on a horse and do archery all the time and be like a badass warrior woman. But also there was so much death in all of these time periods that I'm like, would I actually want to like live in the Middle Ages? Would I actually want to be a woman then? So it's kind of a complex answer. Like in theory, it sounds like it would be really cool. But in actuality, I would probably just like die immediately from some disease.
The smell, though. The smell, Emma, is the one that really gets me up into a point where most people had deodorant. I am not interested in going back there.
I know. I always think like, oh, like I like reading about the Victorian era. It would be cool to go back. I'm like, no, women were nothing. We had no rights at all. It would not be a good time. And there are too many clothes to put on. I could not get away with wearing leggings all the time, and I would be sad. But I think I would say actually the 1920s. I've always loved the 1920s and like the kind of flapper era and all of the happiness until the Great Depression hit. The happiness before the bad times. There's not too much corsets and all of that stuff to have to put on. So I'm going to go with the 1920s. Or when I was, I think the year was 1997. It was a very good music year for me. And I remember like the top 97 of 97 is like a very defining music list for me in my life. I was 11. Oh my gosh, I think that's right. And and it was a good time. So I think I would go back to there. We had a really great summer. We were staying at someone's house on the lake. And so I think I'd go back to that summer as well. Well, thank you everyone for weighing in on that. I think we are going to go to Kareen next. Kareen, what historical fantasy did you bring for us today?
Yes, I have one of those. I definitely do. Despite my panic out about halfway through of like, where's the magic? Where's it going? Really, I hope this shows up at some point because I was halfway through and not enjoying myself. And then thankfully the magic kicked in and I still didn't enjoy myself. But I fulfilled the brief. And I feel good. So this is a story about Ivy Radcliffe. And I do believe that this is a nod to the author Anne Radcliffe, the writer of The Count of Udolpho, because this is a very gothic-y romance that's trying to gothic very hard, does not achieve all of its goals. But we are transported into one of Sadie's favorite time periods. It's 1925. It is after the war, and we have down on our luck Ivy Radcliffe, again, I believe named after the author. And she is in London. She's having a kind of hard time. She's down on her luck. Her beloved brother died in the war. Her father also passed away in the war. And then her mother subsequently passed away in the influenza. So we've got a real orphan situation happening right now. Vulnerable lady in a big city like you do. She is trying to find money, but of course, all the jobs are taken by men who have kind of returned from the front. So she is very much down on her luck, down to her last kind of farthings, pounds. I don't know. Their money is weird. And she is unable to buy even her favorite vice, which are books. Wow. Wow. Feel really bad. Okay, focus. She has a letter in the mail from a solicitor that she has never heard of, telling her to come to the office for news on someone's will. This is a Lord Blackwood, someone that she has never heard of in her entire life, and she assumes that there must be a horrible mistake. However, she goes to the solicitor's office and discovers that she, and only she, is the inheritor of the Blackwood estate, an old crumbling abbey that has seen better times, that she is now the lady of. She has become Lady Hayworth and has inherited this beautiful estate in Yorkshire, which, at least then she wouldn't have to pay rent, which I get. She does have to live in the middle of nowhere in Yorkshire, which seems like a mistake. And of course, when she arrives, there is a slightly creepy old housekeeper, her husband, the butler, who, has butler vibes. And then the young chauffeur / gardener / brooding guy in the background, whose name is Ralph. And I am so sorry, but I cannot take any romantic lead seriously if his name is Ralph. It just doesn't work. But anyways, we're going to put that aside. She gets a tour of her new digs. And as the housekeeper kind of takes her through all of the rooms, she explains there's this, there's that. There's no wireless, but there's a gramophone somewhere. There's, rooms. There is one room that is locked. When she asks the housekeeper about this, the housekeeper says, yeah, don't worry about it. Just say that it's infested with wood lice. Like, be more creative in your omen dropping. But anyways, she kind of heads into her nice little room for the night and is kind of opining about how much it's so much nicer than London when a hairbrush flies across the room. She doesn't seem as worried as perhaps I would be. I get you're tired and you've had a long day, and the gardener / chauffeur / local hottie is like, I'm all gruff and mean. But a hairbrush flew across the room. You are alone in the room, and then you feel a mysterious presence, and then an object defies gravity and flies across the room. And she says, good night, and goes to sleep. And this is her attitude. She gets the hot chauffeur to drive her into town to find a bookstore, but woe and alas, they do not even have a bookstore in this tiny little podunk town. So she gets Ralph to drive her to the next largest village over, where she meets Sir Arthur, a rich guy who's kind of like, which one is Wooster, kind of like Bertie Wooster from Jeeves and Wooster. And he says, well, why are you here at the bookstore? You have the best library in the county. And she says, what are you talking about? The housekeeper took me around the entire house. There's no library. And he says, but of course there is. You have the greatest library of all time, and I would love to see your library. And so she goes back home and forces the housekeeper to unlock the locked room. And lo and behold, there is a beautiful, well-stocked library of dreams, full-on Beauty and the Beast fantasy. However, this isn't quite the refuge that she thinks it is going to be. As she spends more time in the library, she starts getting headaches, strange fuzzy feelings. Her memory starts to go. Time kind of bleeds, and she finds huge chunks of her day missing. And in fact, this kind of strange memory loss starts to invade her regular days as she relives conversations with people and forgets being engaged and, all other things. Something in the library is toying with her. She can feel presence or presences. She can feel something in this house is not quite right. The person that encourages her to go into the library is Sir Arthur. And despite Ralph saying that he's more interested in the library than her, she wants to kind of share the bounty of the library. So she starts to lend out some of the books in the library, despite her housekeeper saying that that's a really bad idea. However, as she loans out the books, strange things start happening in the town. She lends out a book on beekeeping, and then the poor village person is attacked by bees. She gives a book about the Black Plague. I don't know why someone's picking this up for some light reading. And then he gets the Black Plague. Strange things keep adding up one after another as she is losing time, memory, and all sense of who she is. Ivy must fight to save herself and her own stories. So this is the Last Heir to the Blackwood Library by Hester Fox. Maybe I maybe I just end it here. Virginia was so charitable and saying to every book there is a reader. And like, on the surface of it, this is very much up my alley. It's kind of like a ghost story. It's kind of like a romance, gothic horror. It's clearly someone read Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia and was like, yeah, I could do that. Yeah. It's got all the tropes: a helpless lady, house of secrets, damsel in distress, bad atmosphere, terrible weather. Apparently that's one of the tropes of a Gothic novel. She has nightmares. There's a tortured male protagonist, except that his name is Ralph. And it's got melodrama for days. Mm. Okay. I don't want to give like spoilers for this book, but I am going to give spoilers books because like, spoiler alert for me, I'm not going to recommend this book. Is that she's losing her memory, right? She's losing her memory. She's having conversations with people over and over again. The book kind of gets severely disjointed about halfway through as she's kind of losing her grasp on reality. And then we as a reader are like, fine. But there's a real structural problem with it in that, you know, this is Gothic at their core, is about that kind of mysteries, about the houses, about discovering that, but they're also a romance. And so part of like the fun of reading a romance novel is seeing two people fall in love, of seeing like, oh, I care for you, I do this for you, the relationship building, right? And it really doesn't work if at like 4/5 of the book, the male romantic lead, of which we have seen him 5 times, and he's been a giant jerk the entire time, just shows up to her and is like, we're in love. Don't you remember? And she's like, no, but I believe it. And that's it. That's it. That's it. She doesn't remember anything. He's like, oh yeah, we made out on the moor. And she's like, we made out on the moor. Huh. Seems legit, and just goes with it. Like they barely interact 5 times. And he's like, oh, we have this history together and we did all these fun things and you're madly in love with me. And she just believes him. That's not satisfying at all. It's such it's a bananas thing to base your like the structure and plotting of that novel is that we never really see our romantic hero and heroine interact except for the end where he's like, and we're in love, totally in love, and we made out in the grass somewhere, and like you're really, really into me. You just don't remember. And she's like, yeah, I don't remember, but I guess I'm gonna marry you anyways. So it was a real struggle. Yeah, I don't think this book works. I don't think it works. The mystery, I was like, really? Really? I don't agree with that. I think you made a bad choice. So yeah, it's a really frustrating book. And like I think it's like bold of the author to write a book where the protagonist is losing their memory pretty much 3/4 of the way through the entire book. So you're having a hard time following because she's having a hard time following, but you don't like her. So because she saw a hairbrush like fly across the room and was like, sure, and has no questions to ask. None. Look, the housekeeper has been living here for a cajillion years. Same with the butler, same with Ralph. And she's not like, hey, so this place is haunted, right? Like really haunted. And then she finds out like the previous lord died when she's like 43. And she has, again, no follow-up questions. Or if she had the questions, she forgot about them. So we don't get to learn about them. Like she has, ma'am, you're in danger. And when Ralph is finally like, you need to get out of here, she's like, I what? I belong here, gosh darn it. And you're like, no, because you saw a hairbrush fly across the room. You should go. You deserve death. Yeah. And I don't even think this is her first book. Nope. So clearly there are readers. Clearly there are readers for this. I'm not it. I'm just not it. Yep. I'm done.
Well, thank you, Corinne. It's interesting because I feel like that one has come across my radar before because it like sounds like something that I would be interested in. But when characters don't make logical choices in any way, like in no possible way, I struggle with that.
Right. It's just like interrogate this a little bit more. Like you can like be like, oh, there's a ghost. That's fine. But you do need to kind of like interrogate. Otherwise, I think you're an idiot. And I don't want to read a protagonist who's, an idiot. And she is because she watched the hairbrush fly across the room and then had nothing to say about.
I feel like that's our test. We just have to throw a hairbrush like randomly and see how our other colleagues respond to it.
Well, if there's no like fish wire, there's no one else in the room, you're alone. You're alone. She hears like creepy little footsteps and then she sees no one and then she sees the hair and like there's nothing. She kind of like, oh no, I saw it levitate up in the air and then throw itself across the room. That should be a test. It should. If you just walk that off, then you're clearly not operating in the same reality as the rest of us.
Well, maybe there is a reader out there for that book. If that sounds like something you'd like, then good luck. All power to you, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, I think we're going to end off on a slightly more positive note today. Emma, what book have you read for this week?
Yeah, so I liked my book, so we're all good. This will be a positive end for the episode. It actually kind of sounded, Sadie, as you were talking about your book, it sounded kind of similar because mine is also very, very violent, which definitely would not be for everyone. But I like a little darkness. I like a little doom and gloom. So I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the violence. But yeah, so for this week, I have I was digging around on Goodreads to find a YA historical fantasy, because typically a lot of historical fantasies that I would be drawn to end up being YA books. And I found quite a few options that seemed interesting. One of them was the one that Sadie did for the Warrior Women episode, the Moon Goddess one. So I was kind of looking for something maybe a little Asian inspired. And when I saw this one, which is a medieval kind of violent political revenge story with a murder mystery woven into it, I was like, hell yeah, let's do it. Sounds like something I would really enjoy. And everybody on Goodreads was tagging this book as a fantasy. Like, first tag would say historical fiction, second tag would say fantasy. So I'd be like, perfect, this is going to be awesome. All of these reviews are calling this a historical fantasy. So I will be good to go. This book had no fantasy elements into it. I was fully lied to. And as I kept reading it, it was like what Corinne was experiencing. Like, I assumed magic would make itself known. There was this murder mystery. So I was like, oh, maybe the murderer is some like supernatural being. Maybe it's some like mythological creature. Magic is going to be introduced at some point. And I get like 60, 70, 90% of the way through my book. And still, there is no fantasy. So I think what happened is people on the internet saw the cover and they saw that it was historical and they just went historical fantasy. They just fully assumed. But yeah, no, there is no magic in this. But because I was so committed to it, like I was just waiting and waiting and waiting for the fantasy, I finished the book, and it's the book that I'm going to talk about today. So I apologize to my book friends. I technically did not read a historical fantasy. I tried my darndest, but I technically did not read a historical fantasy. Despite all of that, the book was very, very good, and I'm really glad that I finished it. I pulled a Korean and finished it at like 12:30 last night, but it was really good. So I loved it. I'm really glad I picked it, even though it did not technically fit the podcast theme. So apologies to everybody. So this book for today, it's called A Crane Among Wolves. It's by the author June Hur, who's getting a little shout out right now. I haven't read June Hur before. I know she wrote The Red Palace, which I think Corinne probably read based on your reaction. But I really, really liked this one. So I'll probably check out some of her other stuff. And this book is it's brand new. I think it came out in May of this year of 2024. So if you're looking for more 2024 books to read, it's a fast-paced, like historical mystery, violent, political coup d'etat sort of story. No fantasy, but I would highly recommend it. I really enjoyed this one. So I'm glad that I stuck with it despite the misleading reviews on the internet. So this book takes place, and I guess it could be like the late medieval period / early modern period in Korea. Back then, the kingdom was called Joseon. So it's modern day Korea, but now we're in Joseon. And the year is 1506. And our protagonist, 17-year-old Iseul, is on the run. For the past few days, she's been trekking through the wilderness in the Forbidden Territory, a land where no civilians are allowed since it's used as the king's personal hunting grounds. Isiol has lost her home, she's lost her entire family, and everything that she's ever known because of the king. Her life used to be one of prosperity. Her father was a pretty high ranking magistrate, so she grew up pretty wealthy. And she had access to the finest foods and clothes and jewelry and makeup, and she had never known a day of work in her life until the king unjustly murdered her parents, as well as hundreds of other government officials. 2 years following their deaths, Isaol's older sister Suyan was stolen away to become one of the king's thousands of concubines, leaving Isaol alone and afraid. The common people in Joseon are powerless to stop King Yeonsan's tyrannical rule. He commandeers their land for his recreational use, he bans and burns books, and subjects those with literacy skills to intense interrogation and torture. He's afraid of anyone spreading any slander about his reign, and so if you can read and you can write, then he's not going to like you. And he roves around the kingdom, kidnapping women and girls from their homes to turn them into his own concubines. Everyone in Joseon suffers under King Yeonsan's rule, including his favorite brother, Prince Daehyun. Daehyun is Yeonsan's half-brother, and with no legitimate claim to the throne, he appears as non-threatening. But despite that, he's still subjected to Yeonsan's constant physical and emotional abuse. He suffers silently, masking his emotions and fear behind a cold stoicism. But in reality, Daehyun and his close confidants are preparing for a coup d'etat to depose the king and overthrow the government, and hopefully put a more kind and more just ruler in power instead. So, at the beginning of the book, while accompanying the king on a regular hunting trip in the Forbidden Territory, a usual trip that includes all of his royal guards and all of his high ranking officials and thousands of his concubines, so it's a huge, huge entourage. While they're on this hunting trip, Daehyun ends up running into Isaol in the woods, who is injured and on the run. After an aggressive confrontation, he shoots Isaol with an arrow, nicking her in the shoulder, but when other guards arrive on the scene, she is able to slip away from him. Isaol ends up finding her way to an inn in a small village outside of Joseon's capital city, where the kind and cheerful innkeeper named Yul dresses her wounds and offers her a place to stay in exchange for helping at the inn, which Isaol reluctantly agrees to despite never having any work experience. So at the inn, Isaol also meets Won-sik, who is a former royal investigator turned private detective who is trying to catch a mass murderer that's on the loose. This killer wants to kill members of the government, especially the higher ranking members who are sympathizers to the king. And Isaol sees this as an opportunity. The king would want nothing more than for this murderer who continues to kill his supporters and mock his reign to be caught and executed. And surely he would be so thankful to anyone who would be able to catch him that he would offer some type of reward. So Isaol becomes determined to find this killer, who's being called Nameless Flower, and present him to the king in exchange for her sister Suyan, one of the king's new concubines. So Isaol ends up teaming up with investigator Won-sik, who tutors her in the ways of deduction, how to spot clues, how to notice patterns, and how to identify important evidence. And Isaol is a stubborn student, but she slowly learns to become more observant and less self-centered. And by becoming closer to investigator Won-sik and to Yul, the innkeeper, she slowly learns to bring down her walls and to rebuild relationships of trust with those around her, something that she hasn't felt like she was able to do since her parents' violent deaths and her sister's kidnapping. Isaol's father was, like I said before, a high-ranking magistrate in the king's court, and years prior to the story, the king's mother, who was a deposed queen, was assassinated. The king made it his own personal mission to kill any official who he deemed was complicit with his mother's death. And to him, that included anyone who just happened to be in the palace that day. This included Isaol's parents, and so both of them were murdered. After this incident and the kidnapping of her sister, Isaol can no longer trust anybody. She's always been a little bit hot-headed and rebellious, but now she's fully committed herself to a life on her own. That is, until she finds kindness in Won-sik and Yul, and when she crosses paths with the prince again, the one who shot her in the shoulder, he promises to help her with her revenge mission if she will help him with his plans for the coup d'etat. So as the story moves forward, Prince Daehyun and Iseul collaborate to recruit allies for their planned coup, while simultaneously conducting interviews and interrogations to try to track down Nameless Flower. And as they find themselves in more and more danger, getting closer and closer to higher members of Yonson's court, they find that their only option for staging a successful coup is to work closely with those who they trust the least. The men who are more interested in fulfilling their own selfish interests than saving the kidnapped women in the king's possession, or than saving Iseul's sister. So I really liked this book, despite the fact that it was not a fantasy. There was no magic in it, but it had a really gripping mystery that was predictable enough that I could figure out the killer, but not so predictable that it made it boring to solve. Like I didn't know who the killer was until it was just revealed, but I was like, oh, it was totally that guy. And I love a good coup d'etat. I loved it in Full Metal Alchemist. I loved it in Avatar. I love those kinds of stories. So I really enjoyed the political intrigue and the drama. If you like something like Game of Thrones, it's pretty up that alley. But like I said at the beginning, this book is not a fantasy. I was hoping that magic would appear later on. Like I thought maybe Nameless Flower, maybe the killer was supernatural, or maybe some magic force would come in to help with the coup, or maybe something would happen, but nothing happened. And that was fine. The plot was a little bit slow moving. So if you like a faster paced story, this one was more about the big picture of the entire Joseon political landscape than it was about like the individual events themselves. So it was a little difficult to think of like specific plot points to discuss without giving too much away. And much of the story is told through like backroom conversations among political leaders or like crime scene investigations. So there's not a ton of action per se until you get to the end, until they get into the coup. But there is, however, lots of medieval violence. So if you don't like blood and gore or body dismemberments, then maybe this is one that you want to skip. But I enjoyed the historical setting for the book. All I really know about the history of Korea is what I learned from reading Pachinko, which is kind of like 20th century. So for me, this book was really fascinating because it taught a lot about late medieval and early modern Korea. And King Yonsan, the like evil tyrannical king, was actually a real king. He's considered the worst tyrant in Korean history. So like the fear and the violence that's experienced by the characters in the book was very, very much real. Like he was a real person who did these actual things and kidnapped thousands of women and made them his concubines. So I didn't get into a lot of the super gritty details in my summary, but this book comes with quite a few content warnings, especially for violence, as well as sexual assault, violence against women, animal abuse and death, and suicide. So I just want people to understand that before jumping into it. But as you know, I like a little bit of darkness in my reading, so I didn't mind the violence and gore personally. One thing that was unique about the writing style is the author tells the story from both Iseul and Daehyun's perspectives, but Iseul's chapters are in first person and Daehyun's are in third person, which is an interesting choice. So if you don't like that like inconsistency, then you might not enjoy it. I think it was done because Iseul's more motivations are more like personal and emotional, so we get more of her internal dialogue. She wants to avenge her family and save her sister. While for Daehyun, he's very cold, he's very stoic and detached, so we get less of his internal feelings. Like his goals are to stage this coup, so his chapters are more about the conversations he's having with other politicians. But despite the fact that they use different POVs, I still think it was written pretty well. And I enjoyed the writing despite the tonal shifts, but I do recognize that changing from first person to third person might bother some readers. There is also a romantic subplot in the book. It is a very, very, very slow burn. It's an enemies to lovers plot between Iseul and Daehyun. So if you like a little bit of romance, then you might enjoy this one. But yeah, overall, for a book that was described as a fantasy that had no fantasy in it, I really enjoyed it. It's got a, like kind of a quick, like I said, it's not really fast paced, but it's like an intriguing historical action mystery with realistic and flawed protagonists and a lot of really likable side characters. So if you like political intrigue, if you don't mind a little bit of romance, then you should check out A Crane Among Wolves by June Hur, despite no fantasy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emma. Nice to end on a positive note. I know we're not always going to like our books, but that's okay. Thank you, everyone, for finding a historical fantasy and for reading a historical fantasy along with me for this week. If you have read a historical fantasy, let us know which you enjoyed. I'm always looking for more to add to my TBR. And so I'm always loving to get titles in genres that I love. So please let us know what you are reading right now. And if it's historical fantasy, all the better. That's all for us for today. We will see you all next week for another episode of Keep It Fictional. Have a good week, everyone. Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please tell a fellow book lover about it. You can find a list of all the books we discussed in our show notes. Join us next week for another fun book chat. Until then, keep it fictional.